What up, 24-hour party people? It is I, Tim the Brand Weaver, and as always, you have tuned in, you are listening to, you are watching, you are consuming Branding for Breweries, the podcast that brings you the brightest, most attractive, most intelligent minds in the brewing community to help your own brewery thrive and survive. And as always, today is no exception. In fact, today is mega exciting for me because everyone's having that conversation. Indie beer, big beer, who's right, who's wrong? And I don't think it's as simple as that. There's always opinions that we need to embrace from every side. So I reached out to a very dashing gentleman called Jez Galon, who you might know from Brixton fame. Yes, Brixton Brewery. And so Jez is going to join us today to talk about their journey from indie into partnering with Heineken and becoming a really big name. We're going to unpack that and see what the pitfalls are. And equally, he's going to educate us from his side of the table. So without further ado, everyone, welcome to the stage, Mr. Jez. Hey, Jez.
Hi, Tim. Hi, everyone.
How you doing, my man?
Very good. Yeah, excited to, tell our story and hopefully give some insights.
This is what we want, man. We want story. We want those little tidbits that people can go, that's really interesting. I want to do something with that. And like I said to you offline, there's so many things I want to talk about today. So I really want to get stuck into it. I should imagine most people know about Brixton Brewery, so we don't really need to do much of a background on that. But actually, to get started, I would love to know about your journey from under the arches to where you are now, kind of that whistle-stop tour. Could you do that for me, please?
Yeah, sure. So I think, our origin story is quite similar to a lot of the breweries. Started as home brewers, saw an opportunity. Breweries were popping up in Hackney and Bermondsey, inspired by, the son of the forerunners or the forefathers, people like the Colonel. And then just really wanted to open a brewery in Brixton, and put Brixton on the map for beer. We loved the area and we just thought it deserved a local brewery, and we were crazy enough to be the people that thought that they could do it. We had none of the experience, none of the skills, but we really, really believed that we could do it, and we're carried along with that really amazing early day of craft, or the third wave of craft wave. And, we got going in an arch and, we were doing well, but we were kind of landlocked. And then we got this approach out of the blue from Heineken, and I call it embracing the opportunity. And everyone who starts a brand, starts a business, wants it to reach their full potential, and this has obviously given us a huge opportunity to do that.
For sure. So how did Heineken come to discover you? Like, what's the background behind that?
So it's a good question, and I asked the same thing when they did sort of knock on our door. And I think it was a mixture of qualitative and quantitative. So I think they did some panels, looking at various craft brands, various aspects or attributes that they had. And, I think they weren't just looking at the landscape, as a slice through time. I think they were trying to project forward and look at consumer trends. And, as consumer trends shift and change, what is a brand going to look like in the future? And they felt that a brand, deeply rooted in its community. And, I think Brixton, the place, is a brand in its own right. Obviously Camden had previously sold to AB InBev. And, in craft beer, in big beer portfolios, there's quite often Me Too brands.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they felt that, we had a similar potential to Camden. So, yeah, they just emailed us out of the blue and said, can we come down and have a chat? And, I said, of course you can, not really with any, preconceptions of what that would be like. And, I was pretty sure they weren't going to come back, to be honest with you, after they first came down, saw how small, saw how humble we were. But, they really got behind us and behind the community thing. And, that culminated in us, going into effectively a joint venture. They bought 49% of the business, and we opened a new brewery in Brixton, because that was really important to us, to try and keep brewing in Brixton, at least most of the volume, which, as we've grown, that isn't possible anymore. But, that was something that they really got behind as well.
I think that was fascinating. The fact that somewhere in Heineken head office, they had their crystal ball, they were peering into the future and going, right, we need one of these. Who's going to
Yes.
tick all those boxes? And lo and behold, it was Brixton that ticked the most boxes. I'm guessing you'd never know if you ticked all the boxes, but enough to take you to the next stage, right?
Well, definitely not all, because 6 months later they did a similar deal with Beavertown. So
Ooh.
yeah, so Beavertown obviously were a national brand, and we were more a local southeast brand. But you know, they obviously believe that both brands can exist in the same portfolio, and I think we've proven that that's the case. You know, we have a slightly different range and you know, brewing philosophy, and I think you know that really suits you know the modern consumer, shall we say, you know, who doesn't necessarily want anything too crafty, too challenging, too hoppy. You know, a lot of people do, but then we can sit alongside that pretty successfully.
Yeah, kind of that middle ground, nice bridging beer.
Yes, exactly.
So you talk about embracing the opportunity, and what came with that, of course, is increasing production, the shiny kit, all the benefits that come with it. But equally, I'm really curious about, is there anything you had to leave behind, anything you kind of evolved away from?
I think you lose customers. You definitely lose customers because, you know, craft was kind of born out of initially bottle shops, and then it moved into, you know, kind of crafty bars, crafty outlets who really, you know, wanted to embrace independent beer, which is effectively craft beer. And they wanted to support, you know, the upstarts. So of course, when we were no longer perceived as an upstart, you know, those doors closed, but many, many more doors opened. And you know, I call it the best of both worlds. You know, we have our operational independence. You know, we have creative independence. You know, we still brew a lot of different beers, you know, maybe 15, 20 new beers a year and that kind of thing. So that hasn't really changed. But, you know, us as a brand, we're perceived very differently. And therefore we have to, you know, try and, you know, meet bigger customers' needs, which is, you know, quite challenging for a lot of breweries unless you have a lot of resources and support effectively, because that's what those customers demand.
And so you say about losing customers, and I get it. I know the perception of when a brewery jumps from, you know, indie to big beer, whatever labels you want to put on there. But what do you think are some of the biggest misunderstandings that you know that people have about that transition from one into the other?
I think the biggest one, and the one that I see the most often, is the beer changes, and it changes for the worse. You know, people think that, you know, there's a bean counter somewhere in these big beer organizations that's saying you must shave 3p off this and 4p off that and that kind of thing. And in my experience, that has never, ever been the case. No one has even ever looked at our recipes to, you know, do that kind of analysis. So I think if beer does change, it's for other reasons. And I think primarily it's because when you move a recipe from one brewery to another, it will inevitably have to be adapted and changed, and there's a period of dialing in and that kind of thing. So, you know, people are like, oh, the quality's gone down, or, you know, there's not as much flavor. But I think there's sort of a rose-tinted view on what beers used to be like. And, you know, there's a lot of sentiment, there's a lot of emotion in beer, and people remember things maybe not as accurately as they actually are. So they're like, oh, it used to taste much better. One thing that did actually happen when we moved, you know, as being part of the Heineken world effect, is our untapped rating went down. You know, we had a good, high, strong untapped rating, but actually the quality of the beers went up significantly. So while the quality of the beer was going up, the untapped rating was going down. And I think that reflects the kind of sentiment that I'm talking about, that, you know, people, you know, invest emotionally and they don't feel cheated. They just feel like, I guess it's like a band, you know, when they sign for a major label, it's a similar thing. You know, they were like, oh, well, I backed you when you were small and you're not the underdog anymore. So therefore the emotional connection that those people have with the brand changes. But, you know, I think that's probably the main one. I think people think that, you know, big beer is bad and independent is good, and it's a very black and white binary issue. But I strongly don't believe that's the case. You know, I strongly believe that, you know, we are a force for good, you know, to our team, to our customers, to our community. And, you know, I protect our kind of reputation, our integrity, our values, you know, which is one of the reasons I wanted to, you know, obviously have a chat with you. And on the flip side of that coin, you can't just assume that every independent brewery acts with strong values and integrity. So, you know, it's not a black and white issue. You know, there's lots of different shades of gray, shall we say. So I think those are the two main ones that wind me up.
And so you say about kind of like holding on to those values, and from where I sit, I would have thought that must be such a challenge to start, you know, under the arches, small team, a lot of culture ingrained in a location, and that just gets like turbocharged to the beast that it is now. How do you hold on to the likes of your values, the culture, and all of that you established at the very beginning, and keep it true to where you are as a brand now?
I mean, you get stretched and pulled in all sorts of different directions. You know, the most intense period in any brewery's journey is when you're scaling up and you're effectively building a new brewery. You know, that is all consuming. You know, I've done a couple of kind of brewery upgrades and that kind of thing, and yeah, you get burned out. But I think the way that we did it is, you know, we never lost sight of our roots, and we actually doubled down on those community connections. You know, I think it was even more important. You know, we take the name Brixton, but we don't take it lightly, and we need to make sure that we honor it, and, you know, we do things the right way. And by virtue of, you know, having investment and being able to grow the brand, you have more resources. You can hire people, you can, you know, do more community outreach, and that kind of thing. So actually, we've doubled down on that, I would say. You know, we're looking at other ways to, you know, really strengthen that link with the community going forwards as well, so that it's, you know, going to endure, and, you know, make sure that, you know, we maintain and enhance, you know, our kind of commitment to the community. I think it's about, you know, having the right resources, because, you know, you need time to, you know, help in the community. You need time to, you know, support events and go to local, you know, fetes and that kind of thing. So, you know, we always said, you know, we're not going to forget where we came from. We're going to carry that on, because, you know, we are a community brewery effectively. That's the ethos we started with, actually, is, you know, going back to, you know, before there was a huge amount of consolidation in brewing. You know, there were local breweries everywhere, and that's really how we started. We never started out thinking that we would get this opportunity. We just thought, you know, we'll be a brewery in Brixton and service the local community. And then obviously, you know, we were given this fantastic opportunity to go beyond that.
So it's what you mentioned there about, of course, like with the growth becomes resources, and what you get from resources is time. And naturally, pretty much every brewer I talk to who are small indie brewers, the one thing they don't have is time. And I can imagine they would give their right arm a lot of the time to have more time, more staff, and more ability to do the extra things they wanted to. But it certainly does seem that some people get, in their opinion, too much time, and then that at that point that's not fair, because you know, it's a very strange one. It's that idea of us versus them, and how fair is that narrative, really? Like, surely it's an ecosystem and everything works together.
I mean, we know we're in a very privileged position, but we also know what it's like to do the hard yards and graft and wear lots of different hats. You know, I think, you know, we've earned the opportunity that we were given. I'm very grateful for it, obviously, and the team are as well. But, you know, we're not resting on our laurels. You know, we're not saying, okay, we're done, and, you know, we're a guaranteed success going forward. You know, it's just the market is far too competitive, you know, to say that. You know, so we're, we're constantly trying to, go up a level. I kind of talked to the team and I said, let's have the 1% mindset, just try and improve anything by 1%, you accumulate all those gains, and then you move forward, because, all of our competitors are constantly doing that as well. So, I think, we are a lean team as well. So when I say we have resources, we still operate in a pretty lean way. And I actually look at, a number of independent breweries, and they do have, a lot more people than us, I would say. I think, we're subject to full rate of duty by virtue of being owned by Heineken. So that kind of changes the economic landscape and that kind of thing. So, we're not immune from these things, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
And what about, do you feel Big Beer has a responsibility to open the doors or facilitate the growth of independent beer? How does the relationship between the two work in your mind?
It's a good question. I think, if we wind back a little bit to when, craft started, making inroads into the on-trade in the UK, there weren't really craft beers in Big Beer portfolios, maybe some import American craft. And then obviously, consumer interest was really awakened by the kind of beers that we were starting to produce and sell. And then pubs were, wanting to put those on the bar because that's what their customers were demanding. And then, inevitably, Big Beer wanted those brands as part of their portfolio. Some of them had kind of faux craft brands, which weren't really working. So, they wanted to, invest in, the more recognizable, more successful brands. Regional brewers, have got craft brands in their portfolio as well. But I think, we all went into this knowing what we were up against. And, I guess that's why we went into it, because, we wanted to emulate the craft beer revolution that had happened in the US, from the 80s, 90s, noughties. And, that sort of trend came over here. And, we all wanted to not rail against Big Beer, but just wanted to, be part of what was, a very exciting moment in time. I can't think of any other kind of category that's been as disrupted, in terms of, drinks, as craft beer has, come along and done that in the UK. We're still relatively constrained in terms of market share. So, there's still a lot of work to be done. But, I think there was a massive opportunity for all brewers. And, not everyone's going to stay the course and be successful. And, obviously, COVID and cost of living has been a massive, disturbance to people's growth journeys, and that kind of thing. So in terms of your original question, I don't think so. I think it's the other way around. Craft pushed itself, muscled its way into the market, and then, has gained, a decent amount of market share, and, customers, as in pubs, want brands that are recognizable, quality, consistency, decent rate of sale. So I think that's why, there's less opportunity for lots of different brands on the bar. And, the independent kind of micro pubs or crafty bars that, I was talking about earlier, there's probably not as many of them around anymore as well. So there's less opportunity. So, things kind of expanded and then, have contracted for reasons, not necessarily down to, just Big Beer. There's all sorts of things. Consumer trends have shifted as well. I think craft is actually, it's kind of plateaued in terms of volume in the on-trade. And, there's new entrants coming in. So, fruited lagers, stout is taking a lot of volume from craft as well. There's no one you can blame for that other than the consumer, wanting something different right now alongside craft.
And so that kind of, I have to double down and talk a little bit more about the taps and what you can get on taps, because this is the big thing. There's the conversation about Big Beer dominating taps, very hard for independent breweries to get on. But is your take on it, it isn't. It's not as black and white as that, is it? There's more to that story.
Yeah, I think so. And, I think it's driven by operators. Hospitality is under a lot of pressure at the moment. And, some craft brands are more competitively priced than others. So inevitably, craft doesn't have an automatic right to be on the bar. Every tap on a bar has to deliver, margin for the customer, because their margins are very squeezed, and you can't keep passing on higher and higher prices to the consumer. Craft pints are expensive. People are going out less. So, I think that's a headwind. And, you just can't keep adding taps to the bar. It's a fixture that, is pretty crowded already. I think craft has had to adapt. We started with like West Coast IPAs, and then, we moved into kind of East Coast IPAs, and then Westies have come back. And lagers, a lot of craft brewers brew lagers now. I think, a lot of us drop cask, and then some have reverted to cask because, there's different ways of getting on the bar. But if you want to build, like a flagship craft brand, you probably need to bet heavily on one particular beer and try and grow that so that it has got, the recognized place on the bar, and, consumers come back and don't just sort of, rotation nation, which is, I think, a phrase that came out of the US where, people were trying to innovate too much and, giving up a tap that was delivering really good rate of sale for a new product, and then never getting the old, flagship product back on the bar, and that kind of thing. So I think strategies have had to adapt and change, as the market has evolved. The sands are always shifting.
And so, your perspective is it's looking to convince the consumer that beer is the one that's worthwhile to be requested, to be asked for on the taps, more so than trying to, muscle in or knock someone else off. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think you've got to earn your right to be on the bar. You can't just assume that you've got an automatic right to be there and, and blame big beer. There's a lot of stuff in your control. You support the brand well, you activate well, have eye-catching POS and that kind of thing, because the consumer is ultimately who's going to drive your brand forward. Distribution, I agree, is really, really important. There's two things you can't grow a brand without, without distribution, route to market, and also without, the support that customers need, via, glassware, tap handles, bar runners, t-shirts, all that kind of thing. It's a bit of a space race at times. But, you've got to earn your right on the bar. You can't just take it for granted. And there's a lot of breweries and a lot of brands. We're primarily in the London market, which is obviously the most competitive in the UK. Everyone wants to be here, and obviously trends tend to start in the big cities and that kind of thing. But again, going back to strategy, I think you've got to be realistic about what you can achieve. Maybe it's staying local. Maybe it's building your brand through export or off trade if you haven't got the access at the right scale in the on trade. But again, it's not just a black and white issue. You can't just say, oh, it's all big beer's fault. I don't believe that's the case.
Did you at any point prior to obviously that partnering with Heineken, when you were indie, nimble Brixton, Jez, can you empathize with other independent brewers? Like, did you share their thoughts and kind of like it was big beer's fault, and it's only since you've moved into that space that you've become more aware of the other factors that are there? Or were you always a little bit broader minded and considerate of the other factors, I suppose?
Yeah, I think we went into it with our eyes kind of wide open, and we knew it would be difficult to scale and grow. I think you had to get the timing right. And, I think there was a real cohort of breweries that started in 2013 or a little bit earlier. And those seems to be the ones that have kind of grown and become, the more established brands. So, fortunately, we started then, but a lot of breweries did pull quite far away from us because they took more risks and they expanded and they timed it right. And, I just think that was important. Sorry, I missed the second part of your question.
It's a case of going, can you empathize with some of the thoughts and feelings of the indie brewers out there?
Yeah, I can, because we've been there. But, that's kind of, I think, why a lot of us got into it, because, we wanted to embrace the challenge and, try and overcome these hurdles. But, if you look at any kind of industry and market, when it gets challenged, it tends to, consolidate. Bigger companies are not very good at innovation. In other words, the way that they innovate is by, acquiring smaller companies that are more nimble, more startup. So, I think we at least, understood that. And also, we didn't want to be a huge brewery. We just wanted to do something that we thought we would enjoy. So as founders, we had a previous career, a previous life that, we found a bit soul destroying. So, we wanted to try something different. So when we started, we never had an ambition to sell. Like, I didn't think we were ever going to sell the business, to be honest with you. I thought, we'd just sort of start it, get into the community, make friends, and grow organically. And I would have been pretty happy with that, to be honest with you. And then obviously, an opportunity presented itself. And, people say, was it a hard decision? No, it's the easiest decision I've ever made. It's like, yeah, we couldn't, if we wanted to reach our potential, then, that was just something that we couldn't, turn down. And I'm pretty sure that had you asked, a lot of people, if they would have done the same thing, other brewery owners, I'm pretty sure they would say absolutely 100%.
I think you're right. Just in the heart of hearts, if you have such a drive and a passion to achieve a certain goal, there are only a few ways that you potentially may get to a certain level in order to do that. So yeah, I can see why embracing the opportunity to achieve what you kind of went, well, this is the best thing to help us do what we really want to achieve. Completely the right thing. Yeah,
I think by the same token, there were breweries that started with that in mind, that being the kind of the destination. They basically just wanted to scale as quickly as they could and then try and sell the business. And they're still regarded as craft breweries, but I think it's quite easy to spot those kind of brands. You know it when you see it, kind of thing.
So you're saying about, regarded as craft beer or craft breweries. I think this is the perfect segue into, like, are we still in a craft beer era? Are we post craft now? What does craft even mean? Like, what's your spin on it, Jez? What's your take on it? Sorry.
I think there is, obviously a craft community. It's a niche. It always has been a niche. In the past, I've described it as a bubble, a bit of an echo chamber. But I think there is still, that ecosystem of small breweries, tap rooms, that people frequent, the Bermondsey Beer Mile, and that kind of thing. So craft does exist in that niche, in that bubble. But outside of that, craft is less of a relevant term. I think craft brands that have scaled and gone mainstream, are just another brand on the bar. They're like a modern brand, effectively. And I think most consumers don't use the term craft, like the kind of the original ones that, really got us up and running and up and going, the original fans and adorers. I think the bigger brands are just viewed as a more modern different brand on the bar. We actually don't tend to use the word craft. We never really did, because it was, in my mind, it was in some aspects a bit elitist and a bit navel gazing and a bit, I never really got into the world of wine because I found it quite pretentious. And then I wanted to get into the world of beer because, it wasn't like that. And it was more, affordable and, less, pretentious, I guess. But I can understand why, we needed a label, so that we could do the education piece. And, I think the beers that have scaled and grown are the not challenging end of craft. So it depends on where you position yourself as a brewery and a brand, and, what your brewing ethos is effectively. I like to think of it as a spectrum. You got like very trad beer and very ultra modern craft at the other end. And I kind of think of us as sort of right of middle. So there definitely are craft brewers, who stick to the very crafty end of that spectrum. But there's also what you would call craft brewers who have moved outside of that and, gone mainstream effectively.
And in your opinion, is it still craft if they have gone mainstream because of what the offer is, or has it evolved beyond that?
I think craft is a less relevant term in that arena, in that world. Less, it is still got a place, but I think it's less and less important. And, a bit like I was saying, every tap on the bar has to, do the business for the operator. They're not going to give up a tap to a craft brand that, is not got a wide enough appeal and therefore delivers enough rate of sale and enough margin and that kind of thing. So, these big operators, I do think they think about it being a craft brand, but it has to be, a big brand. It has to, do the numbers effectively. So in that regard, I think, we're not quite post craft, but I think we're past peak craft.
And so where do you think that sits now? Because of course we've got the rising term of indie beer, naturally, what Zebra brought to the table with the indie beer campaign. Do craft and indie overlap? Do they sit alongside each other, or do they conflict? Like, paint me that picture of where this sits now in 2025, when we've got a couple of other kind of definitions of what beer may be at the moment.
Yeah, so I can understand why Zebra did move their original definition, which was, sort of certified craft brewer, and then moved it to indie, because, if you sort of talk about it in terms of the product alone rather than ownership, then, if you're not independent, you can still produce a product that falls into the, the craft category. But actually, I think it's a bit unfair, some of the things Zebra have said. They're like, well, the beer has to be made by people who care and are passionate and, with good ingredients. And, we do all of that. I think I joked when Zebra came out with this definition that, I'm going to have to break it to my brewers that, they're not passionate, that they don't care, kind of thing. I don't know how I'm going to explain that to them, because that's, certainly not the case. I mean, the US, has a definition, and it's not kind of based on size or scale, because obviously you got mammoth craft brewers in the US, but there is, an independence aspect to that. I think it's 24% or something like that. It's the maximum that you can be owned by, another brewer. So I think that the two do overlap, but obviously one is more objective than the other. So I can understand the reason that has, come about, that change has happened. But then it's, it gets murky, because you can't be owned by a big brewer, but you can be owned by private equity, or, some other kind of big behemoth or vehicle and that kind of thing, but you're still classed as independent. So, again, what does independence mean? You're kind of blurring that definition, and then, ultimately it comes back to, big beer. You're A-okay if you're not big beer. And if you're big beer, then you're, there's something gone wrong kind of thing in their eyes. So, yeah, it's the rhetoric. I can understand why they polarize it, because they're, obviously representing independent brewers, and, they're a campaigning organization and that kind of thing. But some of the language and the way that they speak, I think is, not representing the situation as accurately as it could do.
That's fair. And we talk, this is all from the brewer's perspective right now. I'm really interested, of course, from the consumer side of things, the person looking at the cans, looking at the taps and going, I like the look of that beer. I would like that beer, please. Like, there have been calls because certain consumers feel, deceived, or it was deceptive, that the likes of, well, take Brixton, for example. The name Brixton, is this beer brewed in Brixton anymore? Where is it? I didn't realize it was a bigger thing. What are your thoughts and what's your take on all of that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. We are transparent with our ownership. We were when we sold 49% of the business, and then when we sold the remaining shares in 2021, we've never tried to hide it, conceal it. We run brewery tours here in our little brewery here, and we always mention it. I want to make it known. We actually are proud of it. We wear it as a badge of pride. In terms of consumers not knowing, I'm not sure how you would even communicate it in a pub. How would you put it on a keg badge or on your glassware or on branded t-shirts? Obviously you could do that on a can or on a website. But, I would say if we're going to go down that road, then everyone should do it. Everyone should declare their ownership and their status. But I don't think that's what the people who make the argument are proposing. They're saying, it should just be, brands that are owned by bigger brewers, who should be declaring it. But, if you want transparency, it needs to be full transparency in my mind. And, I don't think we're deceiving consumers. Again, that's strong language. Where's the deceit? We're not hiding it. It's public knowledge. Press statements have been put out. Mainstream articles have been written about it. There's no campaign to conceal or deceive. It's just not normal that you would, communicate this, to everyone. And, I think if you look at a lot of brands, across FMCG, that's the case in all of those brands as well. Ben & Jerry's is owned by Unilever, for example. Does every consumer know that? I doubt they do, So there's I don't think there's a deceit going on. It's just, that's how it is.
Yeah. Like you're saying, how would you represent it on a tap? And my mind just goes to like the American NASCAR racers who are just covered in sponsors patches.
Yeah.
Do you have to put those on your fonts and on the taps?
Do my staff need to wear a Heineken t-shirt when they're out and about, kind of thing? Like, I don't know how you'd go about doing it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And the question is, from a consumer standpoint, how many of them does it truly influence their choice versus what are they familiar with, what do they recognize, and what do they know? It's a really interesting topic, and I think in my opinion it comes down to the individual at the end of the day.
I believe so. Yeah, people have to vote with their feet effectively, and some people will have strong preferences and opinions, but also people are overloaded with so much stuff in their modern life that not everyone is going to have like the bandwidth and the time to do the kind of digging and research and that kind of thing. And I think as long as they're getting value from the experience, and we strongly believe in delivering value to the consumer, where good looking branding, good events and activation, good product and that kind of thing. And, I think that's what every brand needs to do. That's what you need to nail now. And then you'll build a following with consumers. And, you can't just rely on being independent to do that.
Yeah, sometimes you need that boost if you're going to achieve the total goals. Peter's dropped a comment in the question fields, and we'll come to that in a minute because we've just surpassed the 40-minute point. Actually,
Ooh.
I suppose if you were to go having a chat with a brewer and they're like, I'd love to be where you are. I'd love to have achieved the same thing that Brixton have done. Like, what should they know? What should they be thinking about? What are the boxes that they should be ticking in order to get to that point where you are?
I mean, you've got to have a path to scale. You've got to figure out how you are going to grow, who your consumer is, who your target customers are, how your commercial strategy is going to evolve. Because I think the challenge that some brewers are in now is they did bet on growth, they expanded, they borrowed money to grow, and interest rates have gone up. It's very hard to service that debt. There's a cost of living pressure as well, and they haven't been able to achieve that growth. So don't be too ambitious. In other words, I think be realistic. I would have liked to have grown more than we have done, but COVID, cost of living, younger generation, consumer trends shifting as well, all putting headwinds in our way. So we're not immune from these things. I think just make sure that you know how to go about it, and invest in the right areas of your business, because I think there's a lot of capacity out there in breweries. So putting a lot of capital into equipment is maybe not where you should be focusing. You should focus on other areas. How are you going to raise awareness of your brand? How are you going to get the commercials right? You're going to need salespeople. You're going to need all of this stuff to really give yourself the best chance of success. And having a partner, I think is really important as well. There's Northern Monk, for example, have entered a distribution deal with Estrella, trying to find opportunities like that. It's not an acquisition, but it's a strategic partnership. And, I think those kind of things are worth exploring, because it's hard to do it alone. And, we know that because we were in that boat, before Heineken came along.
I'm going to try and snippet that clip where you're like, don't always invest in the gear, invest in the raising awareness of the brand, potentially the strategy, how you're going to market the brand. Because I know a great guy who's really good at that. Very very attractive.
There you go, Tim. Thanks for that brown envelope.
Yoink. No, but just quickly, Peter from Pillars, he said he's a big fan of what you guys have achieved. He didn't catch the start of the conversation where you kind of expanded on this a little bit, but for the benefit of Peter and anyone else who maybe is tuned in a little bit later today, he says, why do you think breweries like Brixton, Beavertown and Camden were bought by Heineken, InBev, etc.? What do the macro breweries look for? From your perspective, what are they looking for?
I think you've got to have a strong identity. Camden and Brixton are well-known areas in London. I think having that and, being able to build brands in London has been important. Beavertown also did that. They started in the Beauvoir town. So I think kind of shows potential. I also said, I think Heineken were interested in Brixton because AB InBev had, made a success of Camden, and, brewers need, similar type brands in their portfolios. I think it's about the product as well. Neck Oil obviously is a phenomenon. It's a very hoppy beer and it's achieved, massive scale. But I think it, is kind of it's like a lager with a lot of hops. It kind of drinks like that. So therefore it talks to a lot of different drinkers. Obviously Camden had Hell's, which is their hero beer. We have a pale ale called Reliance, which is our hero beer. You know, they're all relatively accessible. So I think that's important, to have that kind of one brand that has a lot of potential to grow. I think that's what is looked for as well.
I'm curious, and you don't have to answer it, but if you look out onto the landscape of the indie breweries right now, are you spotting anywhere you're like, I can see these guys, there's something going to happen with these in the future? Like, can you see a few that you'd recommend to keep an eye on?
Yeah, I've thought about it. You know, some of the big brewers have made their plays already and it hasn't worked out. You know, Carlsberg and London Fields, you know, obviously Magic Rock and Four Pure, you know, haven't worked out as well. But I do think that there's potential for, you know, some brands to be part of, you know, a big beer portfolio. I mean, there's also a challenge, you know, Molson Coors have brought in a beer called Alpacalypse. Yeah, with salt. So prior to that, I thought there was a gap in that portfolio. So I do think there could be opportunities, but the problem is that unless craft continues to grow, then bigger brewers will probably look into different categories instead, you know, beyond beer. You know, everyone's worried about Gen Z and Gen A and that kind of thing. So there could be still an opportunity for acquisition. You know, I think a brewer that I think has quite similar DNA to us, 5 Points in North London, I think, you know, would be an amazing, you know, brewery to have as part of a portfolio, for example. But yeah, I think we need to keep proving ourselves as craft. You know, we need to keep growing the category. Otherwise, you know, big beer is going to, you know, look for the next thing that, you know, may come along. And, you know, it's all about how you measure craft as well, right? So is craft growing? Is it not growing? What do you include in craft? You know, Jubel, for example, is included in craft. Blue Moon is included in craft. You know, so the numbers need to tell the right story, I think, for, you know, investments to continue to happen. I mean, obviously there's distressed investments, but or acquisitions, but no one wants to be in that boat.
No, it's a very different story, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think you're right. It is, as a whole, as a community, there is a shared responsibility to continue to drive what is this term craft and define it how you like, but there needs to be a demand and a want and a growing need for it.
Yeah.
Alongside anything else that may enter the playing field at the same time.
Yeah, we've all got to, you know, earn our right to be on that bar.
Jez, I want to bring this to a close, and this has been a really insightful and enlightening conversation. So let me thank you for that first off. And now I want to close with a question that I've been asking a lot of my guests as we wrap these up. And I just want to tweak it a little bit, because I normally talk to my guests like, you're sat at a bar and turns out you're talking to a brewer. They've got 1 minute before they dash off into the cab and they're out of here. I want to twist it a little bit here, Jez, just to get a summary that you're sat next to a disgruntled brewer who's gone, big beer, you guys suck. I can't get my beer on the bar because of you guys. What can you educate them with in 1 minute before they dive into that car?
I would say, you know, work on the fundamentals, you know, make sure that you are really set up to make a success of the opportunity if you get on the bar, because you have one opportunity. And if you don't do the numbers, you don't have a rate of sale, customers don't like your product, you're never going to stay on the bar or maybe even have the opportunity to get back on it. So you've got to, you know, do everything, you know, make sure that you bring your A game. You know, I go to beer festivals and I try some brewers' beers, and they're not even bringing their A game to a beer festival. So you've really got to, you know, do the best job you possibly can, and, you know, do that 1%, you know, make everything 1% better all the time. And then hopefully you'll get to a place where you get on the bar, people start talking about you, there's a ripple effect. And, you know, that does happen. And we lose taps. We're not immune from it. There's always churn and there's always opportunities. So I think as long as you really, really strive to do the best job, you've got a chance.
Yeah. Focus on you. Make your brewery the best that it can be.
Exactly. Don't look for scapegoats and blame other people. I think it's important, that you really, really do the best job that you possibly can, and hope for the best, and good luck to everyone out there.
Sage words for anyone listening, and for anyone ultimately, Jez. Jez, again, mate, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time. Everyone who's tuned in, who's watching, who's listening now, or indeed listening in the future, I really appreciate you giving us 50 minutes of your well-earned time. I appreciate you're busy, busy people. So this has been great. If you want to listen to any other shows, if you liked this, Jez, do you pop up every now and again? Can people chat to you where they want to?
No, absolutely. Connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email. And always happy to chat. I believe, that we're all in this together still. And, we always try and support people and give, advice and experience if, it's helpful to them. So very happy to do that.
Fantastic stuff. You heard it here first. Just reach out to Jez and it will help you how he can. And from my side of things, if you enjoyed this and you want more podcasts, just search Branding for Breweries in all your favorite streaming platforms, or indeed go to thebrandweaver.co.uk/branding for breweries, sign up to the newsletter, and I'll drop you an email when a new podcast comes out. Everyone, once again, thank you so much. You rock. Have a great day.